Before we begin, we need to be clear about what this series is and what it is not. I'm Elizabeth Moore, and this is Before the Trumpet Sounds. It is a long-form, evidence-based examination of people, ideas, and systems before power fully asserts itself, before outcomes harden, before narratives calcify, and before consequences become irreversible. This series is not driven by ideology. It is not driven by partisanship, and it is not driven by speculation. Each episode will focus on verifiable facts, documented records, and observable structures. Where information is publicly available, it will be presented as such. Where information is not available, that absence will be stated plainly, without inference or assumption. This first episode does not analyze policy. It does not predict outcomes. It does not assign motive or intent. It answers one question only. Who is Zohran Mamdani, based on what can be confirmed from the public record? Before any evaluation of ideas, competence, or consequences can be made, the factual baseline must be established. That is the sole purpose of this episode. Analysis comes later. Judgment comes later. Data comes first. Let's begin. Zohran Mamdani is a public figure whose basic biographical and political identifiers are a matter of public record. He was born in 1991 in Kampala, Uganda, and later immigrated to the United States as a child. Public records indicate that Mamdani became a naturalized U.S. citizen in 2018 and currently holds dual citizenship with Uganda and the United States. Mamdani resides in New York City, where he currently serves as mayor. With respect to religious identity, Mamdani has publicly identified as a Twelver Shia Muslim. He is also a member of the Muslim Democratic Club of New York, a political organization active in city and state-level democratic politics. Politically, Mamdani identifies as a democratic socialist and is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA. Within the DSA, he is part of the organization's State Socialists in Office bloc in New York, a group composed of elected officials aligned with socialist policy positions. Zohran Mamdani is commonly described in public sources as a progressive and left-wing populist, and his policy positions are generally characterized as left-wing. These descriptors reflect how his political ideology has been represented in media coverage and organizational affiliations. These identifiers establish Mamdani's publicly stated political, religious, and organizational alignments. Where such affiliations are documented, they are presented directly. Where information is not publicly available, no assumptions are made. With this baseline established, the next section examines his education, not as a judgment of belief, but as an assessment of training and preparation. Zohran Mamdani earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in Africana Studies from Bowdoin College, a private liberal arts institution. Africana Studies is an interdisciplinary academic field focused on the historical, political, cultural, and social experiences of Africa and the African diaspora. Its curriculum typically emphasizes political theory, social movements, post-colonial analysis, identity studies, and historical critique. What is equally important, for purposes of this series, is what this field of study does not include. There is no indication that Zohran's education involved formal coursework or training in business or enterprise management, accounting or finance, budgeting or fiscal analysis, economics or econometrics, human resources or labor administration, operations, logistics, or organizational systems, public administration or municipal management. Africana Studies is not a vocational or professional degree program. It is primarily designed for academic research, teaching, policy advocacy, or further graduate study in humanities or social theory-oriented disciplines. From a career standpoint, the degree's direct applicability is narrow, with the most common professional pathways being academia, nonprofit or advocacy organizations, political organizing, policy or communications roles. It does not provide technical training for managing large budgets, overseeing complex organizations, or operating systems with payroll, procurement, compliance, and operational accountability. This section makes no claim about Mamdani's intelligence, intentions, or beliefs. It documents only the nature and scope of his formal education and what that education is and is not designed to prepare someone to do. This educational background, as publicly documented, does not provide preparation for executive or managerial leadership. It does not equip someone to oversee large organizations, manage complex budgets, administer payroll and labor systems, or make operational decisions at scale. It is not designed to prepare graduates for senior management roles in either the private or public sector. By any objective standard, this academic training is disconnected from the skills required to run large enterprises, let alone an organization the size, complexity, and financial scope of New York City, which operates at a budgetary scale exceeding that of many Fortune 500 companies. After completing his formal education, Zohran Mamdani's professional background has been concentrated almost entirely within political, advocacy, and nonprofit adjacent environments. His work history, as publicly documented, does not include experience in the private sector, business ownership, executive management, or operational leadership of large organizations. His early professional roles were primarily aligned with political campaigns, ideological organizations, and policy advocacy. These positions typically involve messaging, organizing, research, outreach, and legislative support, functions that are fundamentally different from running operational entities with revenue requirements, payroll obligations, supply chains, capital planning, or profit and loss accountability. There is no public record indicating that Mamdani has managed large budgets, overseen payroll or labor relations at scale, held responsibility for profit and loss outcomes, run a business or operational division, led teams responsible for cost control, productivity, or financial performance, been accountable for sustaining an organization through earned revenue rather than taxation or donations. This distinction matters. Political and advocacy roles operate within environments where funding is externally provided through donors, public budgets, or grants, and where failure does not result in insolvency, layoffs, or closure in the same way it does in business or enterprise management. In contrast, large organizations, particularly those comparable in size to a major city, require constant operational decision-making under financial constraints. Leaders must balance competing demands such as labor costs, infrastructure maintenance, regulatory compliance, long-term capital planning, and revenue sustainability. These are skills developed through direct operational responsibility, not theoretical or ideological engagement. Importantly, this is not a critique of political activism or legislative work as professions. Those roles serve different purposes. The issue is one of transferability. The skill set required to campaign, advocate, or legislate does not automatically translate into the ability to manage complex systems, large workforces, or multi-billion-dollar budgets. As of this point in the record, there is no evidence that Zohran Mamdani possesses any professional experience that bridges that gap. Zohran Mamdani's transition from advocacy-oriented work into elected office followed a path that is increasingly common in modern politics: movement-based organizing, ideological alignment, and coalition-driven electoral support rather than a background in operational leadership or executive management. Mamdani was elected to the New York State Assembly representing District 36, which includes parts of Astoria and Long Island City in Queens. His campaign emphasized progressive and democratic socialist policy positions, including housing reform, public transportation, labor protections, and expanded social programs. These positions aligned closely with the priorities of activist organizations and voter blocs already mobilized around structural, economic, and social change. His electoral success was not rooted in prior experience running organizations, managing budgets, or overseeing complex operations. Instead, it was driven by strong alignment with organized progressive and socialist groups, effective grassroots mobilization, clear ideological messaging, voter dissatisfaction with establishment politics, high engagement among younger and activist-oriented voters. Mamdani received support from organizations and networks associated with the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, as well as progressive advocacy groups operating within New York City. These organizations are highly effective at voter turnout, message discipline, and primary election strategy, particularly in low-turnout races where mobilized bases can have outsized influence. From a governance standpoint, it is important to note what a state assembly role entails versus what it does not. As an assembly member, Mamdani's responsibilities center on proposing and voting on legislation, participating in committees, advocating for constituent interests, engaging in public messaging and coalition building. What the role does not require is direct responsibility for running large operational systems, managing thousands of employees, executing multi-billion-dollar budgets, balancing revenue against expenses in real time, making trade-offs between competing operational priorities. Legislative roles are inherently deliberative and political by design. Success is measured in influence, alignment, and policy outcomes, not in operational efficiency, financial performance, or execution under constraint. This distinction matters because Mamdani's electoral rise demonstrates political viability, not managerial readiness. Voters elected a representative whose appeal rested on perceived values, ideology, and advocacy, not on a demonstrated ability to deliver the outcomes being promised. What is notably absent from both the campaign narrative and much of the media coverage is sustained scrutiny of the mechanics of those promises. Questions such as, how will this be implemented? At what cost? Where does the funding come from? Who ultimately pays? Who benefits? And who bears the unintended consequences? These are not secondary details. They are the core of governance. Yet they are rarely pressed in campaigns driven by broad ideological commitments rather than execution plans. Mamdani has shown himself to be a proficient campaigner. He is effective at messaging, coalition building, and articulating aspirational goals. The unresolved question, and the one voters were not meaningfully asked to consider, is whether the skills required to win on promises are the same skills required to deliver on them within real-world constraints. Political advocacy is about what should happen. Governance is about what can happen, how it happens, and what it costs. Those are different disciplines entirely. Up to this point, we've examined Zohran Mamdani's education, work history, and professional background. Those facts establish something important. There is no record of executive, financial, or operational responsibility at any meaningful scale. That brings us to the final and unavoidable question of this episode: credibility under constraint. Because leadership is not about ideology, it is about what holds when pressure is applied. Mamdani has built his political identity around bold, emotionally compelling promises: defunding or restructuring police services, freezing rents, expanding state-run services, and introducing publicly operated enterprises. These ideas are not framed as hypotheticals. They are presented as actionable commitments. But here is the problem. The mechanics are never addressed. Take rent freezes. Mamdani has promoted them despite well-established legal limits on executive authority in New York City. He knows, or should know, that such actions require regulatory boards, statutory alignment, and judicial survivability. Yet those constraints are absent from his public messaging. That is not a minor oversight. It is the difference between aspiration and execution. The same pattern appears elsewhere. Positions once stated forcefully are later softened or reframed when political conditions shift. Defunding the police is one example. The rhetoric evolves, but without a corresponding explanation of what changed legally, financially, or operationally. That matters, because when policy reversals occur without new facts, they are not learning moments. They are signaling mechanisms. Another example is public sector retail. Mamdani has promoted government-run supermarkets without presenting cost models, startup capital requirements, supply chain plans, labor structures, or pricing discipline. Anyone with operational experience understands that retail fails not from ideology, but from margins, logistics, and execution. None of that appears in the public record. These are not abstract concerns. They are foundational. Cities do not run on slogans. They run on budgets, payrolls, procurement, contracts, regulatory compliance, and risk management. Every dollar spent must be sourced, justified, and sustained. There is no evidence that Mamdani has ever managed or even directly studied systems of that complexity. This leads to a larger issue: selective constraint recognition. Mamdani aligns himself publicly with belief systems, ideologies, and institutional frameworks, yet demonstrates a pattern of embracing or distancing himself from their limitations depending on political convenience. When constraints interfere with popularity, they disappear from the narrative. That is not adaptability. That is avoidance. avoidance, and avoidance is dangerous in executive power. This episode is not an attack on beliefs. It is an examination of whether those beliefs are tethered to reality. Governing requires submission to law, math, logistics, and consequence, not just moral certainty. Which brings us to the central question this series must ask. Has Zohran Mamdani demonstrated the discipline to operate within constraints he does not control, or has his rise been built entirely on promises made without responsibility for delivery? That question is not theoretical. It is the dividing line between persuasion and governance, and it remains unanswered. In this first episode, we focused on foundations: education, experience, professional exposure, and consistency under constraint. Not ideology, not intent, but readiness. What emerges is a clear gap between political messaging and operational grounding. That gap matters because it directly affects how promises are made and whether they can ever be delivered, which brings us to the next and unavoidable step. In Episode 2, we move away from background and into substance. We will examine Zohran Mamdani's campaign promises and stated policy positions one by one, not rhetorically, but structurally. That includes his positions on LGBTQ issues, abortion, crime and policing, drugs and enforcement, immigration, education, budget, taxation, and economic policy. For each, the same questions will apply. What is being promised? What authority exists to deliver it? What does it cost? Who pays? And what trade-offs are being ignored? This series is not about whether ideas sound compassionate or popular. It is about whether they are in accordance with the betterment of society at large and whether they will survive contact with law, math, and reality. That examination begins next. I'm Elizabeth Moore from Before The Trumpet Sounds. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss our next episode.